Every revolution starts in the minds of the people. Arm yourself for the war of ideas. Take back your life. Take back your liberty. Tom Mullen Talks Freedom.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Tom Mullen Talks Freedom. Today, I'm happy to announce I've got Thomas Eddlem on with me from the Libertarian Institute. Tom is the William Norman Grigg Fellow at the Libertarian Institute. He's an economist and a freelance writer, published by more than 20 periodicals and websites, including the Ron Paul Institute, the Future of Freedom Foundation, Foundation for Economic Education, or FEE, the New American, LouRockwell.com, and of course, at the Libertarian Institute. And he's also written 3 books, A Rogue's Sedition, Essays Against Omnipotent Government, and 2 books of academic resources for high school teachers of history, one called Primary Source American History, and the other one, The World Speaks, World History Since 1750, using primary source documents. So we'll link to all of that to the extent it's available. Tom, it's great to have you here with me. Welcome.
Hey, it's great to be back, Tom.
So I wanted to talk a little bit about some of your recent articles on immigration, and the way what you've written kind of hits me is something that I've been suspecting, having bumped into this in other places, which is I canceled cable in 2020 because I just didn't want another penny of my money going to CNN or Fox News or MSNBC or any of them. Like, even if you don't watch them, I mean, if you have a cable subscription so you can watch the hockey game, which was the main thing I had one for, you're still sending some money to these people. And I just consider, most of what passes for news completely false. And then, of course, the response to that is, well, thank goodness we have all this alternative media through podcasts and webcasts on the internet where, you can get the real story. But, you can't assume that the so-called real story is any truer than the one you're getting off NBC News, because you've uncovered several narratives, and some I think that people widely accept at this point that just ain't true. And I guess the first one we'll talk about, and we'll link to this article you wrote on the subject, is that with the massive amounts of immigrants that we've had, legal and undocumented or illegal, whatever you want to call them, over the past 10, 15 years, that we've had a lot more crime. And that of course, it's these immigrants coming from less law-abiding cultures or cultures with different traditions, or just backwards countries, very poor countries where maybe law enforcement isn't as effective. And that's led to an upsurge of crime. What's wrong with that story?
Well, there's a lot of nuance in there. As a general rule, the crime rate in the United States has gone down substantially from the 1990s to today. And the main reason for that is not that Americans are more law abiding, it's that they're older. Old people, tend not to commit crimes. So the average age of an American was in the early 30s in the 1990s. Now it's the late 30s. Most criminals commit their crimes in their teens and their 20s. So with fewer teens and 20-year-olds, you have fewer crimes. As a general rule, crime has gone down. There was an uptick in 2020 with the lockdowns, but the general trend has continued to pace. One exception.
One of the things.
Okay, go ahead.
I was going to say I wanted to dig into that 2020 narrative, because a lot of the people who were very strong on the immigration question were saying, look, they acknowledge what you just said. Crime had gone down from 1990 to 2020, but all of a sudden that trend reversed. And of course, they were attributing some of this to immigrants. I would think lockdowns would have something to do with it. Have you found a connection to either?
Well, I didn't research the 2020 bump because it was a bump up and then back down. So I didn't research that. But one of the things that a lot of the immigration skeptics have really pointed toward has been the increase in rapes across Europe and across the United States. And if you look at the rape rates, they have gone up by 45% and since the last 15 years. And one of the reasons is they've expanded the definition of rape in the United States and across most European countries. It used to be that rape meant, vaginal penetration. Now, not so, not so. It can be, anal penetration, any kind of penetration of the body. So the expansion gets caught up. And in a lot of European countries, like Sweden, for example, the way they account rape incidents changed. Take, for example, about 20 years ago, there was a police captain in my hometown of Taunton, Massachusetts. He confessed to a counselor that he had raped his 9-year-old stepdaughter every night for a year. How many rapes is that? Well, traditionally it's one rape. It's one victim, one perpetrator.
Mm-hmm.
And that's how Sweden traditionally accounted for it. But under their new accounting system, it was 365 because he had done it every day. So it would be, it multiplied the numbers, the accounts. So Sweden's rape rates in 2005 just started multiplying immensely. And a lot of people have attributed that to immigrants, which it really isn't so. Now, immigrants are, in my opinion, and I think according to statistics, more likely to commit crime because they are, at least the new immigrants, tend to be younger, but not more than younger native persons, if you know what I'm saying. An American that's 20, an Armenian that's 20, they're going to have roughly the same criminality rates. And that's pretty much worked out. When you do see the statistics in a lot of European countries and American countries, in the United States, we don't always publish all of the data, but when you do see the data, it does pretty much follow those lines with some racial differences. Africans tend to have slightly higher violent crime rates, not slightly, significantly higher crime rates than Europeans, and Asians have lower crime rates than Europeans. But as a general rule, immigrants, it doesn't matter one way or the other.
And when you say Africans have a higher crime rate, how do their age? Are they younger, even the population in Africa, than Europe, and on average?
Oh, well, that's true too. Yeah, I don't know if that's been adjusted. That's true, but the point is that you can adjust. You can adjust for race. You can adjust for age. There's no immigration crime wave that you can really point to. And in the United States, the crime rate is actually a little bit lower for immigrants. And I think it's partly because about half of the immigrants that come into the United States are screened through the Immigration Naturalization Service. I mean, you have the criminals that are screened out that come in legally, and you have the ones that are not screened that come in illegally. And those are well, they're just sort of, I don't know, not random, but they are people who let me just say, who is the kind of person that would immigrate to a country, leave their country? There would be either the very ambitious, you could argue the best of the best, which America has traditionally gotten. People want to work hard and succeed. Also, people on the run from their crimes. And with an open southern border, with no, the ability for the coyotes to bring criminals across, you could bring some across, and I think that's probably the source of some of the crimes. But overall, it's lower because the ones that do come in legally are vetted.
So I've always suspected that conservatives, right wingers, they always say, look, we welcome immigrants. We just need them to go through the legal process. And I always thought that that was kind of just baloney and that they just didn't want any immigrants at all. But it almost sounds like, from what you just said, they might have a point there that the screening process actually does produce some kind of result where we're going to get, a more law abiding and more productive immigrant. Do you think that's true?
Well, I mean, as libertarians, we would agree that there would be borders, there would be private borders, right? I mean, there
Right.
would be, so there would be, as a friend of mine, libertarian friend of mine said to me recently, there would be guardrails. What are the guardrails? I mean, constitutionally, traditionally, in the United States, the states were the guardrails.
Right.
The states managed immigration up until 1892. So if New York State wanted to let people in, and most people went through New York State system, the Castle Garden system, they they came in, and New York State basically said, okay, you can come here if you can answer yes to two questions, and the second one is three parts. And the first one is, are you a criminal? And if you say, you can say no. Yeah. Are you not a criminal? Yeah. No, I'm not a criminal. Okay. That's answer one. And then the second one is, do you have a means of support? And by the three means of support, we mean, do you have a job offer? Or two, do you have a sponsor? Or three, do you have money to live off of until you find a job? And in New York State in the 19th century, that was $50. That was the equivalent of maybe $5,000 today. So it was enough to live on for a month, with a roommate or whatever, until you found a job. And if you didn't answer yes to one of those three parts, you were considered indigent and you were sent back. So that was the system that we had before. Those were the guardrails. And now we have no guardrails. When the federal government took over, at first they controlled the border, but the United States is so popular a country that there's always how do I put it? There's always a striving to come to the United States, so a place where you can succeed, where you can, live in the land of the free. There's always going to be that driving force bringing people here. So it just created an underground market of people, and now they're no longer vetted, or some of them aren't.
Yeah, and there's two things that you brought up that I wanted to dig a little more into. One of them is the idea that I don't think a lot of people realize that, number one, this used to be done by the states. Number two, James Madison actually said this is a power nowhere delegated to the federal government to regulate immigration other than people who from a country we're at war with. So he did distinguish between alien enemies and alien friends,
Right.
but an alien friend is anybody who's not from a country we're not at war with. And the way the federal government kind of took over that power was through one of those Supreme Court decisions that's at least as spurious as Roe versus Wade. I mean, it's when you read it, first of all, back then they weren't 80 pages. It's much shorter. And they basically make the argument that, like, look, it would be really bad if this was left up to the states because they could get us into a war and then all the other states would be committed. So it must belong to the federal government. I mean, that's basically the argument. The case I'm talking about is called Chilong versus Freeman. And the Freeman was actually the California state immigration officer. So that was who was being sued that eventually, found its way all the way up to the Supreme Court. So if you're a conservative and you don't like an active Supreme Court, well, that's why we have federal immigration, number one, not just that one case, but that was the real key one. And then, I spent all this time arguing just on a basically what, people make fun of libertarians for. Like, look, this isn't, who cares about the academic point that maybe it's not a constitutional thing. But the second part of that argument is the states would, as you just said, do a much better job. And it almost is like what vindicated that position was a few years back when Biden was really had the border wide open, that the states were trying to take some actions and they had to use these tortured invasion arguments and everything because they had already torpedoed their own ability to just say this is a state power. It was never delegated to the federal government, the Constitution. It's just another power that the Supreme Court discovered. And I would, would think there's almost a pathway with the present court to get that back up to bat. But of course, not really, because they want it to be a federal power. They just want to be in charge.
Sadly, you're right. Sadly, you're right. Yeah.
So, and then getting back to the original subject we're talking about. So I think in your article also, you mentioned rape in the United States. So where does that stand? And what part do immigrants play in that, if any?
Well, I mean, the rape in the United States has increased by about, trying to think, the U.S. Justice Department said by about 41% just by the statistical expansion of the definition of the term to include any kind of penetration, and not just of women, but of men. So, the expanded definition.
Let me
took
ask
place-
you too. Sorry to
Yeah.
interrupt again, but is the idea that like if one or both parties are drunk and they have sex, that's a rape? Is that in that number as well?
I don't know.
Because that would really tend to
I
inflate it quite a bit.
Yeah, I don't think so. It depends on it might even depend on the state, but I haven't looked too deeply into that. I looked more at the overall statistics, and I didn't even really look at rape in the United States. I looked at general criminality in the United States, and
Okay.
and found that like all of the studies that have been done show that immigrants have a lower rate of criminality than native born Americans. And I think that's partly because some of them are selected through the INS system,
Mhm.
ICE system.
Okay. And yeah, the other narrative that it's kind of almost something that gets thrown in like as a bonus point or something. Like I keep hearing, maybe not so much recently, but I kept hearing that, and these are all military age men.
Well, I mean,
I'm not
if
supposed
you
to,
look
what I'm
at,
supposed to take away from that. Like, what, you mean like they're going to suddenly like grab a bunch of AKs and start a revolution, or where? I don't know where that's going, but go ahead.
yeah, I mean, if you go back to the Castle Garden and Ellis Island, all of those people that came over, they weren't old folks that came over. They were all young men, usually men first, and then the ladies came later, and not even in the same numbers, because the men were the adventurers. I mean, that's they were the laborers. They were the ones that worked, and that's still true today. If you look at immigrants from Latin America, the men come up first, and they might bring their girlfriends or their wives or whatever later, but or they might marry Americans, but it's the men that come up first, and that's always been the case. And it's certainly true with immigrants from Muslim countries that we've bombed. We didn't have any immigration from Muslim countries until we started bombing them, but now that we have immigrants from Muslim countries, it's the same thing. These are the workers that come in. They're fleeing war and devastation and poverty, and they come here in search of jobs and prosperity and freedom.
And one last thing on that. Yeah, I mean that I could say that like despite my Celtic surname and complexion, my mother was actually 100% Lebanese, and my grandfather came here in the 1920s. Now he was a little bit older. The family story is very interesting, and we won't go into all the details. There are good reasons why he came over then. And the last thing I wanted to say is that when he came over in 1927, I believe, from Egypt, 'cause although of Lebanese descent, my grandparents they lived in Cairo. When he got here, he had to be sponsored by one of his, what were they? They weren't brothers. They were my grandmother's brothers, sponsored my grandfather and my grandmother to come over. And they had to like sign an affidavit saying that if he, couldn't find work or whatever, they would support him.
Right,
And
right.
I did a little research. I guess that's still on the books, but it seems like there's a lot more subsidies going on to the immigrants now, and I'm not sure why that old system is kind of just ignored since it seemed like it kind of worked.
Well, it's a bifurcated system. It's that immigrants, I could say immigrants don't qualify for any kind of welfare financial aid except except refugees. And it used to be a tiny sliver of immigrants, but now it's a huge hundreds of thousands, maybe even it may even touch millions of people where they are the refugees are huge takers of massive subsidies. I'm talking about, more than 50,000 a year over a period of years because we bring them in and many times they don't speak the language. They're not coming in because they have a job offer. They're not coming in through ordinary means. They're coming in from war zones. And, in Massachusetts, I know the state is putting them up in hotels here. We've got 7,500 families here in Massachusetts. They're being put up in hotels. All the Holiday Inn in my hometown is 5 floors of it is all people applying for refugee status in the United States, and the state is paying for their food and their housing at the tune of like $125,000 per family. So it's $1 billion industry. So that's huge. As libertarians, I was tweeting for the Libertarian Party of Massachusetts last year, and I said we should have free immigration and not admit one more refugee. And so one of the Libertarians Party members said to me, "Did you just tweet an anti-immigration tweet?" And I said, "No." I said, "No more refugees, but have a free immigration system." And the reason, and the thinking was, we end the subsidies, and we just allow people to move from place to place like they would if they moved from California to Florida.
Right. And I mean, like we always have to do the disclaimer as libertarians. Look, we wouldn't have the government. We would have private choices being here where you don't want somebody on your property. That's it. And all the property be private, blah, 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 blah. But at least that old system, the affidavit system, would
Yes.
take that away. I mean, okay, if you want to come here, somebody has to want you here, or you have to prove that, you could support yourself because, as you said, I mean, it's actually the law that's on the book, so we don't even really need to change anything. It's just this refugee thing. Now, I've heard people make the argument that a lot of these refugees are fleeing here because of things the US government has done to their countries, whether that's economic sanctions or bomb them, whatever they did in Honduras. I can't remember what it was, but it was pretty horrific when I read about it. So, how much of the refugee issue is really that, and how much of it is people just exploiting the fact that the rules are different for refugees?
It's hard to break it down, but I mean, once people see a system, they're going to try to get in on it, and that's why the refugees system. It started out as a very narrow demographic. It was created during the Cold War to get people who were fleeing from North Korea and from Laos. And I mean, when I lived in Wisconsin, there were a number of people from the Laos who were they were called Hmongs. They were a minority, ethnic minority in Laos, and the CIA had propped them up as a rebel group and said, "You're going to take over this country," and they were never going to. Just like in Syria and in Iraq, the Kurds were never going to be the majority. It was the same deal. Just like in Afghanistan with the the ethnic minorities there, they were never going to that they were funding. They were never going to take over. Well, when everything collapsed, they said, "All right, we'll bring a bunch of them here." And they brought a bunch of the Hmongs to Wisconsin and then some to California, and they put them on welfare. And the interesting thing was, I grew up in Boston, and the stereotype of Asians in Boston is, oh, they're all smart, they're all good in math and science, blah blah blah. You go out to Wisconsin, and they're all, oh, Asians, they're all gangbangers, and they're all, criminals and stuff. And it was because they'd crushed their culture with welfare,
Mhm.
and it was a different thing. And I was just, what is this? But that's what happened.
We've only got a few minutes left here, but I
Yeah,
wanted to touch on the other article because let's say, it's generally just not true that bringing in immigrants are going to raise the crime rate any more than, a baby boom would, and a lot more 20-year-olds than we have right now.
right.
But the conservatives would also argue that, you know, bringing these people in from so many different countries and so many countries without the traditions we have. First of all, the traditions of liberty, the English Commonwealth law system that our system grew out of, and then also, the kind of the Christian tradition that you just won't have the same country anymore culturally in a few generations where, the people that whose descendants came from that culture still make up, a majority of the population. What's wrong with that argument?
Well, I mean, culture is one of those cloud arguments, right? It means when someone advances a cloud culture argument, they're saying there's something I believe in strongly that I want to preserve, but I'm not going to tell you what it is. But that's my objection to immigration, and it could be crime, but it also could be just something like a religion. It could be a race. It could be, it could be mannerisms or whatever. And if you look at those different categories, the immigrants, one, they don't generally tend to change the majority anyway. I mean, we've never had a majority change in the United States, and we're probably not likely to. The interesting thing that happened in the 2010s was that Hispanics were no longer the majority immigrants. It was Asians.
Mhm.
So, I mean, there was a fear in the 1850s. Oh, we become a majority Catholic country because we're taking in all these Irish and all these German Catholics, and and then we started taking the Italians in. But then what happened? It never happened. I mean, the Italian the Catholic churches is the largest church, but it's maybe 25%. And so it's not that. And if we look at for example, another example, the the British common law. Well, if we want to preserve our common law heritage by bringing in immigrants who honor the common law, then what we want to do is exclude people from Northern Europe who aren't part of the British Isles, because none of them have a heritage of the common law. But we can bring in people from Tanzania, from Malaya, from countries all around the world, part of the British Empire, India, Pakistan. These are countries that have this history of the common law, and I'm not sure that we need to do that, because if you look back, well, what happened in the 19th century? We didn't bring in immigrants from British Commonwealth countries. We brought in people from Tsarist Russia, King Victor Emmanuel's Italy, from Otto von Bismarck's Germany. We brought in, people from the tyrannies of all of Europe, and they were fine. I don't think that's necessarily the case. Many of the people coming in today have much more of a history of voting and elections and separation of powers than any immigrant from 19th century. I mean, an immigrant from, a Jewish immigrant from Poland in 1900 would have never voted in anything, but an immigrant from Costa Rica today would have voted his entire adult life.
Yeah, and one of the arguments is, this is the one that cracks me up, is, well, you're getting these people from all these socialist countries, and of course that's going to mean they're going to vote for socialist policies. Of course, modern socialism came from Europe, right? So I don't know, they're always saying, well, can't we get Europeans? No shortage of socialism there. All right, so Tom, let me push back a little and say I watched the Matt Walsh podcast, and he's definitely conservative. He's got a lot of libertarian. He's a lot more libertarian than I would expect him to be, when he's not being tongue in cheek and saying, nobody should be able to vote and that kind of thing. Which actually, I actually agree with that, but not probably in the same way. But he put up some numbers, and generally, and let's just assume that these were probably accurate. But he said that, if you had been in New York for less than 5 years, I'm talking about the recent election for mayor. If you had been in New York for less than 5 years, there was some very high chance you voted for Mamdani, like 85%, something way up there. And then if you had been there longer, and it may have been 10 years or longer, or something like that, but not born there, you were something like 65% was the support rate for Mamdani. But that if you were born in New York City, I think the number he put up, and I'm going on memory, was 52%, which is still a win, but much lower. So what do we make of that? Isn't that some evidence for the conservative theory that if you bring in a lot of people from other places, they're going to vote more socialist, or, more radical?
Well, I mean, first of all, we're talking about people that just moved to New York City from somewhere else. So it could be Massachusetts, it could be Texas or whatever. But let's just, for the sake of argument, say they're all immigrants. I think the real demographic change was younger people. The younger people voted for Mamdani because the Republicans and Democrats both, they just got behind Andrew Cuomo 100%. He was, even though he was a serial sexual harasser, he was a grandma killer during the COVID years. He was, he was just, Nepo baby, everything. And he basically said, yeah, I'm a legacy, and you're going to get it whether you like it or not. And I'm not going to do anything for you. And Mamdani came in and said, well, I kind of like what Cuomo does, but you know what? I'm going to give you a free subway fare. And the young people said, well, at least he's offering us something. And that was it. Because it's not that they wanted socialism. They just said, look, we can't afford to live here. And the Cuomo is not running the city well. And Eric Adams is not running the city well. So let's get someone else in here to do it, who at least promises regular guys something.
Yeah.
I mean, that's why Trump won too. He said, he went to the Rust Belt states and he said, I'm for you guys. I'm for the regular guy. He wasn't, but that was all it took. And he got elected. Down in Argentina, Javier Milei, he said, oh, the socialists, they're stealing from you. Their inflation is ruining the middle class. I'm going to stop that. That got him into the presidential ballots. Now, I hope he actually does something, but voters react to people who say we're going to give you something, and not to people who say you'll get nothing and you'll like it.
Yeah, and we definitely need to stop socialism. We can't have people like Mondami getting elected. We need more people like Donald Trump, who's now collecting tariffs and saying he's going to send all the money to just anybody. Here's a $2,000 check and my name's on it. Not socialism when we do it that way. I guess it's what do you call it? A dividend, a tariff dividend. And like the math kind of matches up. I guess they've collected something like 200 billion in tariffs this year. And if you take a percentage of the households below a certain income level and divide it, a billion is 1,000 million, and there's something like 130 million households. So if you chop off 20% of those and say we're gonna give the bottom 20% these checks, it kind of works out. But it's really no different. You're just collecting taxes and handing out the money. I don't. Tell me, you're an economist. What is there a difference here?
Well, it's all getting thrown out by the Supreme Court by a 9-0 vote next year. But no, I mean that's all it is. It's redistribution of wealth. And unfortunately, what the way it's going to work out eventually is the only people that'll get the rebate, because it has to go through Congress to get the rebate, will be the importers who imported the goods. And the consumers will pay the high price, and then the importers will apply for the rebate of the tax paid, and they'll get it back. That's what's going to happen.
Oh,
So
okay. I didn't know that was those are the details on it, because I'm
well,
thinking back to
it's not
George
approved
Bush.
yet. It's not approved
Right,
yet.
right,
But I mean,
right.
that's what the Supreme Court's ultimately going to settle on. I mean, it's blatantly unconstitutional. Presidents can't raise taxes. They can't raise
Well,
tariffs.
there's that. Yeah, I mean they have the bogus emergency, so it's like, well, unless it's an
Yeah.
emergency, that emergency clause in the Constitution where the Constitution seems to cover a war, but not an emergency. So that's when we got to
Yeah.
anyway, assuming all that until it's struck down as unconstitutional, which I'd love for like somehow or other that emergency thinking to be curbed. Like the reason that Trump can impose a tax, which is supposed to be exclusively in the purview of Congress, is Congress passed a law that said, well, if there's a national security risk in an emergency, he can impose a tariff. And then he just declares everything, whatever he wants. I want to tariff France. Here's the emergency. You know, I'm imposing a tariff on France. So it'd be great if somehow the Supreme Court took a bite into that. What I'm, you know, why I'm pessimistic about that is because, like, with things like the vaccine mandate, they had a chance to bite into the non-delegation doctrine, but they didn't really. There's like, well, you're doing it too much. And then as far as the incorporation doctrine with was it Roe versus Wade? Yeah. They didn't, I mean, they completely affirmed it. And then they struck down a New York state gun law using the incorporation doctrine. So I'm just afraid that on principle, this court might find maybe they want to curb Trump a little bit, but it's not going to get us on a path to a more constitutional system.
Probably not. Probably not.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. So yeah, I guess, as far as now that you kind of pointed out the young person argument, that makes more sense. And it does make a good point. The categories that were set up for this Mondami analysis, I don't know. They really don't mean a heck of a lot. As you said, didn't live in New York City 5 years ago. Maybe I lived in Texas,
Right.
probably didn't come from Texas and vote for Mondami unless you're under 30 years old, right? And then
Right.
doesn't matter where you come from. So anything that in either one of these subjects, the culture, crime, the founding fathers, anything that we haven't covered on this tonight that you'd like to get off your chest?
Ooh. Well, I mean, all right. The one thing I didn't cover in my article was the whole Hijira argument for immigration. Are you familiar with this?
No, enlighten us all.
Okay. So one of the arguments against immigration is, well, what happens is Muslims try to populate a country, take it over by populating it with their own, using what's called the jira. Yeah, it goes back to the early days of the Quran, where basically they immigrated into an area and they got a cultural majority, and then they were able to take over the country. But it's not, and so the argument is, oh, that's what they're trying to do to America. That's what they're trying to do to Europe. Look, all the Muslims are going to Europe. They're going to America. They're trying to take over these countries. But really, what it is not Hijira. It's Obama. It's bombing all the bombs that we're sending over there. That it's Obama. That's bringing them here, because they didn't come before we started bombing them. If you go across Europe in the 1980s, there were a few Turks in Germany and there were a few Algerians in France, but that was it. I mean, and it was only after we started the massive bombing campaigns across the Middle East that you have these massive waves of immigration, and it's not a Muslim secret plot. I mean, it kind of goes back to oh man, there was also a conspiracy theory about Hispanics trying to repopulate and take over the old Mexican America, the part of America that was taken over by the United States during the Mexican-American War,
The
California.
Reconquista, right?
Yeah,
Reconquista. Yeah.
Reconquista. There was a term for that too. But I mean, it was just, that's not the plan, okay? No, nobody's in Guadalajara planning to retake California from Mexico, and nobody is in Baghdad planning to take Paris for Iraq. It's just not, or for the great, what's the term the Muslims use for the Islamic world? The Ummah, the Ummah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
Different one. Yeah. I know the Sharia law. I've heard that thing. I didn't know it was called Hijira, but okay.
yeah,
So yeah. Right. And I think going to the Muslim thing, and here's something like I remember seeing a lot of clips of Bill Maher making these points about, not necessarily excluding immigrants, but that just the awareness that large groups of Muslims agree with all these nutty things, like if you leave the religion, you should be killed or something like that. And one of the things about stuff like that is, I guess my answer to that is talk is cheap, right? So if you ask
right.
you call up, you're doing a phone survey and you call up some Muslim on the phone. Do you think if people, leave the religion, they should be killed? Yeah, it's easy to say yes. Yeah, because that's what the Quran says. But okay, go ahead and do it then. Here's a guy, you know what I mean? Well, how many of
Yeah,
them are
yeah.
really ready to do it? And even if they wouldn't do it themselves, how many are really ready to, like, if they were confronted with a real case, to vote as a juror to kill that person? Probably not very many. So, and I guess I would liken that to a lot of right wingers who might say they're ready to shoulder a weapon and, and start a civil war or whatever like that, or left wingers. To actually get out there and do it is a lot different than, saying it on a podcast or in what's that place, 4chan or wherever they might be saying it. So anyway, yeah, this is all good stuff. I mean, is there any, really the last question, because is there any other side to this that we're not, we're kind of punching holes in the anti-immigrant story? Is there anything to the other side? Is there anything, to be fair, that we should acknowledge, that, massive immigration could be a problem?
Yeah, I think that we were on the cusp of a real problem. I think with Hispanic immigration, we ran into a like a Canada problem, right around 2000. Because it's easy to divide a country that doesn't speak the same language. And we were at the point where everything was becoming bilingual, Spanish and English. And we're kind of moving away from that now because the immigrants, I mean, we still have a lot of Hispanic immigrants, but English is the language of America. I mean, when your grandfather came from Lebanon, Lebanese was never going to be the national language of the United States. When my grandmother came from Sweden, Swedish was never going to be the national language of the United States. But with the large numbers of people coming from Spanish-speaking countries, we almost came close to that. And I think it's easy to divide a country based on not being able to speak with each other. So I think we were close to that. I think you could make a case for that. But we're moving away from that issue today because, we have more immigrants from Asia, more immigrants from, China and India and countries like that.
Yeah, that's a good point. I haven't seen as much of like the default is like you have to choose English if you want it.
Right.
And I don't hear as many Spanish speakers. I hear all kinds of people when you have to call somewhere, that's generally going to be somebody who's, English is their second language just because of the nature of that job. I used to run call centers, so I'm pretty familiar with that. But yeah, that's a fair point. And I've always, the last thing I'd say is like, okay, when we're naturalizing people, we make them swear like an oath to the Constitution. And I think we should make them swear an oath to capitalism. I mean, to me, the Constitution, it's all kinds of holes in it. And that, to me, as long as you want to come here and respect private property, I don't care. And again, we've talked about a lot of ways where a private property system or even a state system would screen people for that a lot better. I'm hanging on to, the people that none of the governments are good, but the higher up you go, or the farther away from the local community you go, generally the less the people know about, your local situation and the less effective they are. So yeah, if you could have Texas enforcing immigration the way they like, and California wants to be wide open, let's see which one does better. We had that system here. It's not like it hasn't been tried. And it was just another one of those things where the Supreme Court decided we want the federal government to do it. So anyway, talked about a lot here. I appreciate you coming on. We'll link to your articles and your page at the Libertarian Institute. I understand you're also doing some podcasting yourself. What's the name of it and where do we find it?
Yeah. I started up a podcast about 4 months ago. It's called Blue Collar Breakdown. It's on YouTube, Rumble, and Spotify, Facebook. I'm going to get it on more outlets as well going forward. It's live every Wednesday night at 8:30, and you can obviously listen to it later. But it's just more of a focus on economics from hey, I'm a blue collar guy. I work in the trades, and I also have an economics degree. And
We'll talk about that story the next time.
Oh yeah. So definitely tune that in. I have a guest sometimes, but when I'm solo, I typically keep it to half an hour, so it's short.
All right, we'll link to that again, Tom. Appreciate you taking the time, and we'll get back together soon.
Yeah, always a pleasure, Tom.
The war of ideas has only just begun. Arm yourself with the knowledge you need by heading to TomMullenTalksFreedom.com and subscribing to our email list. And remember, every revolution starts in the minds of the people.